Mom, why didn't you tell us the buyers were threatening legal action? My son asked over the phone. I stood very still in my kitchen, one hand resting on the edge of the counter while the kettle hissed softly behind me. Buyers? I repeated quietly. What buyers? There was a long silence on the other end. Then I heard my daughter-in-law's voice in the background. Sharp. Irritated. Oh my God, she's pretending again. Just tell her they already sold the house. The house? For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The rain tapped gently against the windows of my small apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. Outside, the streets were gray and wet from an early spring storm. Inside, everything suddenly felt cold. What house, Daniel? I asked again, slower this time. The Georgetown property, he said, sounding frustrated now. The old townhouse Dad left sitting empty for years. We sold it 3 weeks ago, Mom. The buyers are furious because federal agents showed up there yesterday. I lowered myself carefully into a chair at the kitchen table. My late husband's townhouse. The one nobody had lived in for over a decade. The one Howard had specifically told me never to transfer, never to renovate, never to discuss with anyone outside the family. Even after 42 years of marriage, he never fully explained why. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, let out a dry laugh loud enough for me to hear through the phone. Honestly, Daniel, she probably forgot she even owned it. I closed my eyes. Vanessa always spoke about me that way. Like I was old furniture left in the corner of a room. Something people stopped noticing until it became inconvenient. But this time, something in her voice unsettled me. Because Howard had not been a careless man. My husband had worked for the State Department for over 30 years. Quietly. Carefully. The kind of man who locked file cabinets inside other locked rooms. The kind of man who lowered his voice whenever certain subjects came up at dinner parties. And that townhouse. That house was different. Mom. Daniel pressed. Did Dad leave you any paperwork? Anything at all? Because these people are talking about lawsuits now. I looked slowly toward the hallway. Closet. Toward the old navy blue lockbox sitting on the top shelf behind my winter coats. The box Howard made me promise never to throw away. I may have something, I said carefully. Vanessa scoffed again. Oh please. It's just an abandoned building. No. It wasn't. And deep down, for the first time in many years, I realized my husband may have been protecting far more than a house. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. Because what my family discovered next changed all of our lives forever. After the call ended, I sat alone at my kitchen table for a very long time. The kettle had stopped whistling minutes earlier, but I still hadn't moved. Rainwater slid slowly down the windows beside me, blurring the lights from the street outside. My tea had gone cold before I even poured it. At 70 years old, silence had become familiar to me. Especially after Howard died. The apartment felt smaller without him in it. Quieter. Howard used to fill every room without even trying. The sound of his shoes near the doorway. The low hum of jazz music from his study. The way he folded the newspaper into perfect squares every Sunday morning. Now all I heard was the refrigerator humming and the pipes clicking behind the walls. I lived simply these days. A modest 2-bedroom apartment in Alexandria. Nothing fancy. Just enough space for me and my books, and the old wooden desk Howard brought home from Brussels back in the 80s. Most mornings followed the same routine. Coffee at 6. Crossword puzzle by the window. A short walk if my knees allowed it. Then dinner alone by 7. Daniel rarely visited anymore. Our conversations had slowly turned into rushed phone calls between his meetings. Birthdays became text messages. Holidays became "we'll try next year, Mom." And Vanessa? Well, Vanessa always made me feel like I was standing slightly outside my own family. Not openly cruel. Never loud enough for others to notice. But there were small things. The little sigh whenever I repeated a story. The way she corrected me in front of people. The way she once laughed and told her friends, "Old people keep everything. Margaret still has paperwork from the Cold War." At the time, everyone chuckled politely. I did too. But Howard didn't laugh. That night, after they left, he stood quietly at the kitchen sink drying a wine glass. His expression had changed in a way I couldn't explain. Then he looked at me and said something I never forgot. "If anyone ever asks about the Georgetown house, say as little as possible." I remember smiling at him. "Howard, it's just an old townhouse." "No," he said softly. "It isn't." That was the strange thing about my husband. Even after 42 years together, there were parts of him that remained carefully locked away. Not because he didn't love me, but because some habits never leave men who spent their lives protecting secrets. I finally stood from the kitchen table and walked slowly toward the hallway closet. The old Navy lockbox sat exactly where I'd left it years ago. Dust covered the top. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it down from the shelf. Because for the first time since Howard's funeral, I was beginning to think my son had made a terrible mistake. The lockbox was heavier than I remembered. I carried it carefully back to the kitchen table and brushed the dust from the top with my sleeve. The metal surface was scratched near the corners. Howard had owned it for as long as I could remember. It followed us from London to Vienna, from Ottawa to Washington. Back then, I never questioned why. When you spend decades married to a diplomat, you learn not to ask about every locked drawer. I turned the small brass key slowly inside the lock. The sound alone sent a chill through me. Inside were folders arranged with Howard's usual precision. Dark blue, grey, cream-colored envelopes sealed with faded stamps. Every document perfectly aligned, even after all these years. And right on top sat a thin red file marked, "Georgetown property, do not transfer." I stared at those words for several seconds. Then I opened it. Most of the paperwork made little sense to me at first. Legal language. Government references. Old authorization numbers. But one phrase appeared again and again. Federally restricted diplomatic trust asset. My heartbeat slowed. Not faster. Slower. The way it does when fear becomes very real. I suddenly remembered a dinner party from nearly 15 years earlier. We were still living in DC then. Howard had invited 2 men from the State Department over for drinks. I remember walking into the study with a tray of coffee and hearing one of them laugh quietly. "Honestly, Howard, that townhouse still being active is unbelievable." Howard noticed me standing there immediately. The room went silent. A second later, he smiled politely and changed the subject. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now I understood why he looked nervous. My phone buzzed suddenly against the table. "Daniel." I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," he said quickly, "the buyers are demanding answers. Vanessa said you found some paperwork." "A few documents," I replied carefully. "Well, can you send pictures or something?" "The title company froze the funds this morning." Frozen funds. So the sale money hadn't gone through. Good. In the background, I could hear Vanessa pacing. "This is ridiculous," she snapped loudly enough for me to hear. "Nobody protects abandoned houses, Daniel." I looked down again at the papers in front of me. One page carried an official seal. Another listed federal restrictions tied to foreign diplomatic agreements dating back decades. Howard hadn't been exaggerating. That townhouse was never truly abandoned. And suddenly, memories started returning to me one after another. The strange visitors. The unmarked cars parked outside overnight. The security cameras Howard installed himself. The way he insisted on paying the property taxes personally every single year, even after retirement. My son thought he had sold an empty old building. But deep down, I was beginning to realize he may have accidentally touched something far bigger than our family. I barely slept that night. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but the apartment still felt heavy and cold. I sat in Howard's old reading chair with the red file open across my lap while the clock on the wall ticked softly in the dark. Some memories grow louder as you age. Especially the ones you ignored at the time. I kept thinking about the Georgetown townhouse. The narrow brick building on a quiet street lined with old trees and iron fences. To most people, it probably looked forgotten. The curtain stayed closed. The mailbox was always empty. No lights at night. But Howard never treated it like an abandoned property. Not once. Even after retirement, he drove there every month without fail. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes. Sometimes 2 hours. Whenever I asked what he was doing, he always gave the same answer. Just maintenance. Nothing more. At the time, I accepted that explanation because that's what wives of diplomats learn to do. You stop pushing after enough years. You learn that silence is sometimes part of the marriage. But looking back now, the signs were everywhere. I remembered one winter evening nearly 20 years ago. A black sedan had been parked outside the townhouse when we arrived. 2 men in dark coats stood near the entrance speaking quietly with Howard. The moment they saw me, the conversation stopped. One of the men nodded politely. The other looked nervous. Howard walked me back to the car almost immediately afterward. "We're leaving already?" I asked. "Yes," he said calmly. "There's nothing for us here tonight." "Nothing for us?" "Not nothing there." I understand that difference now. My phone vibrated again just after 6 in the morning. Vanessa this time. I almost didn't answer. "Margaret," she said without greeting me properly, "we need those documents today." Her tone wasn't worried anymore. It was irritated. Like I was creating inconvenience instead of cleaning up their mistake. "The buyers are threatening fraud claims," she continued. "Daniel said you found old government paperwork, but honestly, it's probably outdated." I stayed quiet. Then she sighed sharply. "You know, if that place was so important, maybe you should have told your family." Family. That word stung more than I expected. Because after Howard's funeral, they slowly stopped treating me like part of theirs. Fewer invitations. Shorter visits. Long pauses whenever money came up. And now they had sold something they never even bothered asking me about. Not because they needed the house. Because they assumed I was too old to matter. Vanessa kept talking, her voice thin and impatient through the phone. But I wasn't listening anymore. I was staring at one sentence typed across the bottom of the final page in Howard's file. Transfer of property subject to federal review and diplomatic authorization. My hands went cold. Because my son hadn't just sold the wrong house. He may have violated rules neither of them even knew existed. Around 9 that morning, someone knocked on my apartment door. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. The knock was slow and deliberate. 3 firm taps. I opened the door carefully and found an older man standing in the hallway wearing a charcoal overcoat despite the warming spring weather. Grey hair. Leather gloves. Calm eyes that looked strangely familiar. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he gave me a small nod. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Yes?" "My name is Arthur Bennett. I worked with your husband years ago." The name hit me immediately. Howard mentioned Arthur only a handful of times during our marriage, always carefully, always quietly. Usually after late-night phone calls he refused to explain. I stepped aside without another word. Arthur entered slowly, removing his gloves as he looked around the apartment. His eyes landed briefly on the red file still sitting open on the kitchen table. And the color drained from his face. "Oh no," he muttered softly. That was the moment my stomach tightened. He walked closer to the documents without touching them. "They sold it?" he asked quietly. I nodded. My son said the house had been sitting empty for years. Arthur let out a tired breath and lowered himself into the chair across from me. That property was never considered abandoned, he said. Not legally. The apartment suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, I could hear traffic moving along the wet street below. Somewhere in the building, a television played faintly through the walls. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Arthur adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. Howard didn't tell you everything because he was trying to protect you. Protect me from what? He hesitated. Then he chose his words carefully. Let's just say the townhouse was tied to agreements made decades ago connected to long-standing diplomatic agreements overseas. Certain properties remained under federal oversight long after those operations ended. I stared at him. You mean the government still monitors that house? In certain ways, yes. A chill ran through me. Suddenly all those strange years made sense. The monthly visits. The security systems. The locked basement Howard never wanted contractors entering. Arthur leaned forward slightly. Did Daniel personally sign the transfer documents? I believe so. He closed his eyes briefly. That's bad. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just two quiet words spoken by a man who clearly understood consequences. My phone buzzed again across the table. Daniel. This time, when I answered, his voice sounded different. Panicked. Mom, he said quickly, someone from a federal office contacted the buyers this morning. They're saying the sale may be invalid. Arthur looked at me silently from across the table. Then Daniel lowered his voice. Mom, what exactly did Dad leave us? I looked at Arthur before answering my son. The old man gave a small shake of his head. Not yet. Daniel, I said calmly, I think you and Vanessa should stop speaking to the buyers for now. What? He snapped. Mom, this is serious. I know. No, I don't think you do, he said, his voice rising. The title company froze nearly $2 million this morning. Apparently an old federal restriction code appeared during secondary title review. The buyers are threatening legal action, and now federal people are involved. Vanessa is terrified. From across the kitchen table, Arthur remained perfectly still. That unsettled me more than panic would have. Did you read any of the original property documents before selling the house? I asked quietly. There was silence. Then Daniel exhaled hard. We thought it was just an old property Dad forgot about. We. Not I. We. It was always easier to make bad decisions feel smaller when shared between two people. I closed my eyes for a moment. Howard spent his entire life paying attention to details. Every signature. Every lock. Every document. Meanwhile our son had sold the townhouse like it was an unwanted storage unit. Vanessa suddenly grabbed the phone. Margaret, with all respect, none of this makes sense, she said sharply. People don't secretly keep government houses hidden for decades. I almost smiled at that. Because Howard never hid the house. He protected it. There's a difference. I'll call you later, I said softly. Before either of them could answer, I ended the call. The apartment became quiet again. Arthur finally leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. They're in trouble, he said. How much trouble? That depends on how far the transfer process went. I looked down at the paperwork scattered across the table. Every page now felt heavier than before. What exactly was that house used for? I asked carefully. Arthur hesitated again. For the first time since arriving, he looked uncomfortable. There were periods during the late 80s and early 90s when certain diplomatic properties were used for secure meetings involving foreign officials, he said slowly. Your husband supervised several of them. I stared at him. In my house. In that townhouse, yes. A strange feeling settled over me then. Not fear. Not shock. Something colder. Because suddenly I realized Howard trusted me with something important without ever fully explaining it. And after his death, my own family treated that responsibility like junk waiting to be sold. Arthur stood and buttoned his coat. "You need a lawyer immediately," he said. "And Margaret," he paused near the door. "If federal officials contact you, answer carefully. Your husband protected that property for a reason." After he left, I walked slowly toward the apartment window. Down below, the city moved normally. Cars. Pedestrians. Morning traffic. But somewhere across Washington, people were now asking questions about a townhouse my son never should have touched. By that afternoon, Daniel had called me 6 times. I didn't answer immediately. For years, I had been the one waiting for his calls. Waiting through missed holidays. Waiting through delayed visits. Waiting for short conversations squeezed between his meetings and Vanessa's dinner plans. Now suddenly, I was the center of attention again. Funny how quickly people remember your importance when money disappears. I finally answered around 4 o'clock. "Mom," Daniel said quickly, sounding exhausted, "where are the original property documents?" "At home." "Can you bring them downtown?" "The attorney wants to review everything tonight." "Attorney?" "Not Mom. Are you okay?" "Not Mom, I'm sorry. Just documents." In the background, I heard Vanessa speaking rapidly to someone else. "The buyers are furious," Daniel continued. "They said federal officers entered the property this morning with authorization papers." I walked slowly into my kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee before replying. "What kind of officers?" "I don't know," he admitted. "They wouldn't explain anything." That answer told me more than he realized. Real federal investigators rarely explain themselves immediately. I stared out the window while Daniel kept talking. The sky above Alexandria had turned pale gray again. Cars crawled through wet intersections below my apartment building. Somewhere nearby, a siren echoed briefly through the city. Normal life continued. Meanwhile, my son's world was quietly falling apart. "Mom," he said again, lowering his voice, "did Dad ever tell you what that house was really for?" I thought about Howard standing silently in his study late at night. The locked drawers. The coded phone messages. The visitors who never gave full names. And all the years I chose not to ask questions because I trusted him. "He told me enough to know it should never have been sold," I said calmly. Daniel exhaled shakily. Then, for the first time since this began, I heard fear in my son's voice. Real fear. "Vanessa thinks we should contact the buyers directly and offer their money back." "With what money?" I asked quietly. Silence. "The frozen funds." "Of course." I sat down slowly at the table. "You already spent some of it, didn't you?" Neither of them answered. That silence confirmed everything. A headache settled behind my eyes. Howard had spent decades protecting that property while our son treated it like a lottery ticket. Then Vanessa suddenly grabbed the phone again. "Margaret, if you know something, you need to tell us now," she snapped. "People from some federal office showed up asking questions about your husband." "Your husband?" "Not Daniel's father. Not family. Just your husband." I closed my eyes briefly. Then I answered in the calmest voice I could manage. "You should have asked questions before selling a house you didn't understand." And for once, Vanessa had nothing to say back. That evening, I finally returned to the Georgetown townhouse. For the first time in almost 3 years. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. Quiet sidewalks. Brick row houses glowing under soft yellow streetlights. Expensive cars parked neatly along the curb. People walking small dogs as if nothing unusual had happened there that morning. But the moment I stepped out of the taxi, I noticed the black SUV parked half a block away. Official federal, my stomach tightened. The townhouse itself stood dark and silent at the end of the row. Tall windows. Black shutters. Narrow stone steps leading to the front door Howard painted himself nearly 20 years ago. Someone had already placed a real estate sign near the sidewalk. Sold. The word felt ugly there. Daniel was waiting outside, pacing nervously with his coat half buttoned. Vanessa stood nearby, holding her phone tightly against her chest. The second she saw me, she rushed forward. "Margaret, thank God," she said quickly. "These people won't tell us anything." These people. Not officers. Not investigators. Just people standing between them and their money. Daniel looked exhausted. Dark circles under his eyes. Tie loosened. Hair messy in a way Howard would have hated. "Mom," he said quietly, "they restricted access to the basement." I froze. "The basement?" He nodded. "One of the federal agents said nobody is allowed down there until the review is complete." I looked toward the townhouse windows again. Howard never allowed anyone into that basement. Not contractors. Not guests. Not even Daniel when he was younger. Back then I thought it was because of old storage or government paperwork. Now I wasn't so sure. A cold wind moved through the street. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. "This is insane," she muttered. "It's just a house." "No," I said softly. "It never was." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel looked at me carefully. "Mom, who exactly was Dad?" That question stayed in the air between us. Because the truth was, even after 4 decades of marriage, there were parts of Howard Whitmore I never fully understood. I remembered nights waking up at 2 in the morning and finding his side of the bed empty. The sound of quiet phone calls behind closed doors. Trips overseas with almost no notice. Men in suits waiting downstairs without introductions. And always the same sentence whenever I asked too many questions. "It's better if you don't know." At the time, I believed that was simply part of diplomatic life. Now I realized it may have been something else entirely. Suddenly the townhouse door opened. A tall man in a dark overcoat stepped outside holding a folder. He looked directly at me. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Me. Then he walked down the steps and said quietly, "Mrs. Whitmore, we've been trying to reach you regarding your husband's federal protection agreement." The man introduced himself as Richard Hale from a federal property review office. Not law enforcement. Not local police. Just a quiet government official carrying a folder thick with paperwork. And somehow, that felt even more serious. Vanessa immediately stepped forward, clutching her handbag tightly against her side. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said quickly. "We legally sold the property." "You attempted to transfer the property," Hale corrected calmly. "Not sold. Attempted to transfer." I noticed the difference immediately. His eyes returned to me. "Mrs. Whitmore, may we speak privately for a moment?" Daniel looked confused. "Wait, you're here for my mother." Hale gave a small nod. "Your husband listed Mrs. Whitmore as the sole controlling trustee tied to the property restrictions. Not once did he ask Daniel for permission to continue. That changed the entire feeling of the street. For the first time since this began, my son looked like the outsider instead of me. I followed Marshal Hale a few steps away from the townhouse while Daniel and Vanessa remained near the sidewalk whispering anxiously to each other. The marshal opened the folder in his hands. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't seen in years. Howard's signature. Federal authorization seals. Property restrictions. Then one phrase near the top caught my attention immediately. Federal diplomatic property restriction. My chest tightened. Hale lowered his voice slightly. "Your husband voluntarily maintained this property under a long-standing federal agreement connected to former diplomatic operations." "So Arthur was telling the truth," I whispered. The marshal nodded once. "We believe your son and daughter-in-law were unaware of the restrictions." Unaware. Such a gentle word for such a dangerous mistake. I looked back toward Daniel standing under the streetlight. He looked exhausted now. Smaller somehow. Like the confidence had drained out of him over the last 24 hours. For a brief moment, I remembered the little boy who used to wait by the front window for Howard to return home from overseas trips. But people change. Especially when money enters the room. What happens now? I asked quietly. The transfer is suspended indefinitely, Hale replied. Federal attorneys are reviewing whether the sale violated protected asset regulations. Apparently the original title review missed several older federal filings connected to the property. Behind us, Vanessa suddenly raised her voice. This is insane. Nobody told us any of this. Several people walking nearby turned to stare. I closed my eyes briefly. Even now, she spoke like the victim. Not once had either of them apologized for selling the house behind my back. Not once. Daniel walked toward us slowly. Mom, he said carefully, if you knew the house mattered, why didn't you tell me? That question settled heavily between us. I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. Because your father trusted me to protect it, I said softly. And I never imagined my own family would try to sell it without asking. Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. But Vanessa crossed her arms. Well, maybe if people didn't keep secrets enough, Daniel snapped suddenly. The street fell silent. Even Vanessa looked shocked. It was the first time I had seen my son defend me in years. But deep down, I knew it had come too late. 3 days later, the transfer officially collapsed. Not quietly. Not privately. Completely. I was sitting in my apartment folding laundry when Daniel called again. This time, he sounded like a man who hadn't slept properly in days. The escrow account's frozen, he said immediately. Every dollar. I folded one of my sweaters carefully before answering. I assumed that would happen. Apparently the initial title search missed several older federal filings, Daniel said, his voice shaking. But secondary review flagged the restricted trust status. I said nothing. Mom, they're saying the sale may have violated federal property restrictions. In the background, I heard Vanessa crying. Not softly. Angrily. The buyers filed claims against the brokerage, Daniel continued. Now everyone's saying we failed to disclose restrictions we didn't even know existed. That was the part one still couldn't understand. Howard spent his entire life teaching Daniel to read every line before signing anything. Even as a child, Howard used to hand him newspapers and say, details matter more than confidence. But somewhere along the way, my son stopped listening. Or maybe Vanessa convinced him that older people simply hold on to useless things. Either way, they gambled with something they didn't understand. And now the bill had arrived. Later that afternoon, I met with an attorney recommended by Arthur Bennett. Her office sat inside an old stone building near DuPont Circle. Quiet. Professional. No dramatic reactions when she reviewed Howard's paperwork. Which somehow made the situation feel even more serious. She adjusted her glasses and looked at me calmly. Mrs. Whitmore, based on these documents, your son was never authorized to independently transfer a federally restricted trust asset. I nodded slowly. I thought so. The sale should never have passed preliminary review, she continued. But once federal preservation status appeared during secondary verification, everything stopped. Secondary verification. A restricted filing buried in decades-old trust records was enough to stop everything. My attorney closed the file gently. Your husband set this up very carefully. That sentence stayed with me. Very carefully. That was Howard. Always thinking 10 steps ahead. Always preparing for things nobody else noticed. When I returned home that evening, Daniel and Vanessa were already waiting outside my apartment building. Vanessa's makeup was smeared slightly beneath her eyes. Daniel looked older than he had a week earlier. Neither of them spoke immediately. Then Daniel finally stepped forward. "Mom, we may lose everything." I studied my son quietly. The expensive watch. The tailored coat. The polished life he and Vanessa built so proudly. All of it suddenly fragile. And for the first time, I realized something painful. They never saw the Georgetown house as part of Howard's legacy. They didn't see Howard's legacy. They saw dormant equity. Vanessa finally spoke, her voice shaking. "We didn't know." I looked at her for a very long moment. Then I answered honestly. "No," I said softly. "You just never cared enough to ask." A week after the sale collapsed, I received an invitation to return to the Georgetown townhouse. Not from Daniel. Not from Vanessa. From the Federal Review Office handling Howard's agreement. The message was formal and brief. Mrs. Margaret Whitmore is requested to attend final documentation review regarding protected diplomatic property status. Even reading those words felt strange. For years, people treated me like a lonely widow living quietly in a small apartment. Invisible. Harmless. Easy to dismiss. Now suddenly, doors were opening for me again. When I arrived at the townhouse that morning, 2 black vehicles were parked outside. The sold sign was gone. So were the realtor lockbox and the promotional flyers. It looked like the house had erased the entire transaction by itself. A younger officer opened the front door for me immediately. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitmore." Respectful. Careful. I noticed Daniel standing near the staircase inside the foyer. He looked uncomfortable in his expensive navy suit, almost like a guest in his own childhood home. Vanessa stayed silent beside him. That alone told me how much things had changed. The townhouse smelled exactly the same as it always had. Old wood. Dust. Coffee lingering faintly inside the walls from another lifetime. For one painful second, I expected Howard to walk out of his study carrying one of his folders. But silence greeted me instead. Marshall Hale appeared moments later carrying several documents. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "after reviewing your husband's agreements and trust protections, the property will remain under preservation status." I nodded quietly. Then he added something unexpected. "Your husband designated you as the sole controlling trustee." Daniel looked at me sharply. Sole authority. I could almost hear the realization forming in his mind. Howard hadn't forgotten me after all. He trusted me. Completely. The marshal continued speaking. "The property cannot be sold, transferred, or modified without your direct authorization, and federal officials now needed my authorization." Vanessa lowered her eyes immediately. For weeks, she had spoken to me like I was confused. Fragile. Outdated. Now government officials were waiting for my decisions. Not hers. Mine. Daniel swallowed hard. "Mom, why didn't Dad ever tell me any of this?" I looked at my son carefully. Because despite everything, part of me still remembered the little boy who used to run down these same stairs in socks too big for his feet. "Your father believed some responsibilities had to be earned," I said softly. Nobody answered after that. The silence inside the townhouse felt heavy but clean somehow. Like truth finally settling into place. Then Marshall Hale handed me the final folder. Inside was a preservation trust authorization prepared years earlier in Howard's handwriting. My name sat beside every major decision. Not Daniel's. Not Vanessa's. Mine. And for the first time in many years, I no longer felt like the forgotten person in the family. 3 months later, the Georgetown townhouse stood exactly where it always had. Quiet. Untouched. Protected. The Federal Review officially closed without criminal charges, but the financial damage left behind was enormous. The brokerage company backed away from Daniel and Vanessa completely. The buyers filed civil claims. Legal fees piled up faster than either of them expected. And the frozen money never truly became theirs. In the end, almost all of it disappeared into attorneys, penalties, and settlements. Funny how quickly easy money turns expensive. Daniel changed after that. Not overnight, but slowly. The sharp confidence faded first. Then the impatience. Then the habit of speaking to me like I was someone standing in the way of his life. Sometimes pain teaches lessons that love cannot. Vanessa, however, never fully recovered from the embarrassment. Their friends heard about the failed sale. People in their social circle whispered about the diplomatic property scandal. Invitations became less frequent after that. Not because anyone hated them. Because people become uncomfortable around greed once it's exposed publicly. As for me, I stopped trying to earn space in rooms where I was only tolerated. That may have been the greatest lesson of all. One quiet Sunday morning, I returned alone to the townhouse carrying a small box of Howard's belongings. His old fountain pen. A pair of reading glasses. The brass compass he kept on his desk for nearly 30 years. The house smelled the same as always. Old books. Wood polish. Time. Sunlight stretched across the floors in long golden lines while dust drifted slowly through the air. For the first time in years, the place no longer felt heavy. Just peaceful. I walked into Howard's study and opened the curtains carefully. Outside, Georgetown moved quietly beyond the windows. Couples walking dogs. A delivery truck passing slowly down the street. Ordinary life continuing as it always does. Then I noticed a handwritten envelope resting on the desk drawer I had never fully emptied. My name was written across the front in Howard's careful handwriting. Margaret. Inside was a single folded note. Nothing dramatic. Just one sentence. Some homes are not meant to be owned. They are meant to be protected by the people strong enough to understand their value. I sat there for a very long time holding that piece of paper. And suddenly, after all the anger and confusion, I finally understood what Howard had been protecting all those years. Not secrets. Not government files. Not even the house itself. Trust. The belief that someone would still do the right thing even when nobody was watching. I locked the townhouse carefully before leaving that afternoon. Then I placed the keys into my purse and walked slowly down the front steps into the cool Washington air. Not as someone forgotten. Not as a burden. But as the person my husband trusted most in the world.